The Psychology of Human Misjudgment by Charlie Munger, continued. 14. Deprival superreaction tendency. The quantity of man's pleasure from a $10 gain does not exactly match the quantity of his displeasure from a $10 loss. That is, the loss seems to hurt much more than the gain seems to help. Moreover, if a man almost gets something he greatly wants and has it jerked away from him at the last moment, he will react much as if he had long owned the reward and had it jerked away. I include the natural human reactions to both kinds of loss experience: the loss of the possessed reward and the loss of the almost possessed reward. Under one description, deprival superreaction tendency. In displaying deprival superreaction tendency, man frequently incurs disadvantage by misframing his problems. He will often compare what is near instead of what really matters. For instance, a man with $10 million in his brokerage account will often be extremely irritated by the accidental loss of $100 out of the $300 in his wallet. The Mungers once owned a tame and good-natured dog that displayed the canine version of deprival superreaction tendency. There was only one way to get bitten by this dog, and that was to try and take some food away from him after he had already had it in his mouth. If you did that, this friendly dog would automatically bite. He couldn't help it. Nothing could be more stupid than for the dog to bite his master, but the dog couldn't help being foolish. He had an automatic deprival superreaction tendency in his nature. Humans are much the same as this Munger dog. A man ordinarily reacts with irrational intensity to even a small loss or threatened loss of property, love, friendship, dominated territory, opportunity, status, or any other valued thing. As a natural result, bureaucratic infighting over the threatened loss of dominated territory often causes immense damage to an institution as a whole. This factor, among others, accounts for much of the wisdom of Jack Welch's long fight against bureaucratic ills at General Electric. Few business leaders have ever conducted wiser campaigns. Deprival superreaction tendency often protects ideological or religious views by triggering dislike and hatred directed toward vocal non-believers. This happens in part because the ideas of the non-believers, if they spread, will diminish the influence of views that are now supported by a comfortable environment, including a strong belief maintenance system. University liberal arts departments, law schools, and business organizations all display plenty of such ideology-based groupthink that rejects almost all conflicting inputs. When the vocal critic is a former believer, hostility is often boosted both by 1. A concept of betrayal that triggers additional deprival superreaction tendency because a colleague is lost, and 2. Fears that conflicting views will have extra persuasive power when they come from a former colleague. The foregoing considerations help account for the old idea of heresy, which, for centuries, justified much killing of heretics, frequently after torture and frequently accomplished by burning the victim alive. It is almost everywhere the case that extremes of ideology are maintained with great intensity and with great antipathy to non-believers, causing extremes of cognitive dysfunction. This happens, I believe, because two psychological tendencies are usually acting concurrently toward this same sad result. 1. Inconsistency avoidance tendency plus 2. Deprival superreaction tendency. One antidote to intense, deliberate maintenance of groupthink is an extreme culture of courtesy, kept in place despite ideological differences, like the behavior of the justices now serving on the U.S. Supreme Court. Another antidote is to deliberately bring in able and articulate disbelievers of incumbent groupthink. Successful corrective measures to evil examples of groupthink maintenance have included actions like that of Derek Bach, when, as president of Harvard, he started disapproving tenure appointments proposed by ideologues at Harvard Law School. Even a 1-degree loss from a 180-degree view will sometime create enough deprival superreaction tendency to turn a neighbor into an enemy. As I once observed, when I bought a house from one of 2 neighbors locked into hatred by a tiny tree newly installed by one of them. As the case of these 2 neighbors illustrated, the clamor of almost any group of neighbors displaying irrational, extreme deprival superreaction over some trifle in a zoning hearing is not a pretty thing to watch. Such bad behavior drives some people from the zoning field. I once bought some golf clubs from an artisan who was formerly a lawyer. When I asked what kind of law he had practiced, I expected to hear him say divorce law, but his answer was zoning law. Deprival superreaction tendency has ghastly effects in labor relations. Most of the deaths in the labor strike that occurred before World War I came when employers tried to reduce wages. Nowadays, we see fewer deaths and more occasions when whole companies disappear, as competition requires either takeaways from labor, which it will not consent to, or death of the business. Deprival superreaction tendency causes much of this labor resistance, often in cases where it would be in labor's interest to make a different decision. In contexts other than labor relations, takeaways are also difficult to get. Many tragedies, therefore, occur that would have been avoided had there been more rationality and less subconscious heed of the imperative from deprival superreaction tendency. Deprival superreaction tendency is also a huge contributor to ruin from compulsion to gamble. First, it causes the gambler to have a passion to get even once he has suffered loss, and the passion grows with the loss. Second, the most addictive forms of gambling provide a lot of near misses, and each one triggers deprival superreaction tendency. Some slot machine creators are vicious in exploiting this weakness of man. Electronic machines enable these creators to produce a lot of meaningless bar lemon results that greatly increase play by fools who think they have very nearly won large rewards. Deprival superreaction tendency often does much damage to man in open outcry auctions. The social proof that we will next consider tends to convince man that the last price from another bidder was reasonable, and then deprival superreaction tendency prompts him strongly to top the last bid. The best antidote to being thus triggered into paying foolish prices at open outcry auctions is the simple Buffett practice. Don't go to such auctions. Deprival superreaction tendency and inconsistency avoidance tendency often join to cause one form of business failure. In this form of ruin, a man gradually uses up all his good assets in a fruitless attempt to rescue a big venture going bad. One of the best antidotes to this folly is good poker skill learning young. The teaching value of poker demonstrates that not all effective teaching occurs on a standard academic path. I myself, the would-be instructor here, many decades ago made a big mistake caused in part by subconscious operation of my deprival superreaction tendency. A friendly broker called and offered me 300 shares of ridiculously underpriced, very thinly traded Belridge oil at $115 per share, which I purchased using cash I had on hand. The next day, he offered me 1,500 more shares at the same price, which I declined to buy partly because I could only have made the purchase had I sold something or borrowed the required $173,000. This was a very irrational decision. I was a well-to-do man with no debt. There was no risk of loss, and similar no-risk opportunities were not likely to come along. Within 2 years, Belridge sold out to Shell at a price of about $3,700 per share, which made me about $5.4 million poorer than I would have been had I been then psychologically acute. As this tale demonstrates, psychological ignorance can be very expensive. Some people may question my defining deprival superreaction tendency to include reaction to profit barely missed, as in the well-documented responses of slot machine players. However, I believe that I haven't defined the tendency as broadly as I should. My reason for suggesting an even broader definition is that many Berkshire Hathaway shareholders I know never sell or give away a single share after immense gains in market value have occurred. Some of this reaction is caused by rational calculation, and some is no doubt attributable to some combination of 1. Reward super response, 2. Status quo bias, from inconsistency avoidance tendency, and 3. The endowment effect, from excessive self-regard tendency. But I believe the single strongest irrational explanation is a form of deprival superreaction tendency. Many of these shareholders simply can't stand the idea of having their Berkshire Hathaway holdings smaller. Partly, they dislike facing what they consider an impairment of identity, but mostly, they fear missing out on future gains from stock sold or given away. 15. Social proof tendency. The otherwise complex behavior of man is much simplified when he automatically thinks and does what he observes to be thought and done around him. And such followership often works fine. For instance, what simpler way could there be to find out how to walk to a big football game in a strange city than by following the flow of the crowd? For some such reason, man's evolution left him with social proof tendency, an automatic tendency to think and act as he sees others around him thinking and acting. Psychology professors love social proof tendency because in their experiments, it causes ridiculous results. For instance, if a professor arranges for some stranger to enter an elevator wherein 10 compliance practitioners are all silently standing so that they face the rear of the elevator, the stranger will often turn around and do the same. The psychology professors can also use social proof tendency to cause people to make large and ridiculous measurement errors. And of course, teenagers' parents usually learn more than they would like about teenagers' cognitive errors from social proof tendency. This phenomenon was recently involved in a breakthrough by Judith Rich Harris, who demonstrated that super respect by young people for their peers, rather than for parents or other adults, is ordained to some considerable extent by the genes of the young people. This makes it wise for parents to rely more on manipulating the quality of the peers than on exhortations to their own offspring. A person like Ms. Harris, who can provide an insight of this quality and utility, backed by new reasons, has not lived in vain. And in the highest reaches of business, it is not all uncommon to find leaders who play followership akin to that of teenagers. If one oil company foolishly buys a mine, other oil companies often quickly join in buying mines. So also if the purchased company makes fertilizer, but both of these oil company buying fads actually bloomed with bad results, of course. It is difficult to identify and correctly weigh all the possible ways to deploy the cash flow of an oil company. So oil company executives, like everyone else, have made many bad decisions that were quickly triggered by discomfort from doubt. Going along with social proof provided by the action of other oil companies ends this discomfort in a natural way. When will social proof tendency be most easily triggered? Here, the answer is clear from many experiments. Triggering most readily occurs in the presence of puzzlement or stress, particularly when both exist. Because stress intensifies social proof tendency, disreputable sales organizations engaged, for instance, in such action as selling swampland to schoolteachers, manipulate targets into situations combining isolation and stress. The isolation strengthens the social proof provided by both the knaves and the people who buy first, and the stress, often increased by fatigue, augments the target's susceptibility to social proof. And of course, the techniques of our worst religious cults imitate those of the knavish salesman. One cult even used rattlesnakes to heighten the stress felt by conversion targets. Because both bad and good behavior are made contagious by social proof tendency, it is highly important that human societies, 1, stop any bad behavior before it spreads, and 2, foster and display all good behavior. My father once told me that just after commencing law practice in Omaha, he went with a large group from Nebraska to South Dakota to hunt pheasants. A South Dakota hunting license was, say, $2 for South Dakota residents and $5 for non-residents. All the Nebraska residents, one by one, signed up for the South Dakota licenses with phony South Dakota addresses, until it was my father's turn. Then, according to him, he barely prevented himself from doing what the others were doing, which was some sort of criminal offense. Not everyone so resists the social contagion of bad behavior, and therefore we often get Serpico syndrome, named to commemorate the state of a nearly totally corrupt New York police division, joined by Frank Serpico. He was then nearly murdered by gunfire because of his resistance to going along with the corruption in the division. Such corruption was being driven by social proof plus incentives, the combination that creates Serpico syndrome. The Serpico story should be taught more than it is now, because the didactic power of its horror is aimed at a very important evil, driven substantially by a very important force, social proof. In social proof, it is not only action by others that misleads, but also their inaction. In the presence of doubt, inaction by others becomes social proof that inaction is the right course. Thus, the inaction of a great many bystanders led to the death of Kitty Genovese in a famous incident much discussed in introductory psychology courses. In the ambit of social proof, the outside directors on a corporate board usually display the near ultimate form of inaction. They fail to object to anything much short of an axe murder, until some public embarrassment of the board finally causes their intervention. A typical board of directors culture was once well described by my friend Joe Rosenfeld. As he said, "They asked me if I wanted to become a director of Northwest Bell, and it was the last thing they ever asked me." In advertising and sales promotion, social proof tendency is about as strong a factor as one could imagine. Monkey see, monkey do is the old phrase that reminds one of how strongly John will often wish to do something or have something just because Joe does or has it. One interesting consequence is that an advertiser will pay a lot to have its soup can instead of someone else's in a movie scene involving soup consumption, only in a peripheral way. Social proof tendency often interacts in a perverse way with envy, jealousy, and deprival superreaction tendency. One such interaction amused my family for years, as people recall the time when my cousin Russ and I, at ages 3 and 4, fought and howled over a single surplus shingle, while surrounded by a virtual sea of surplus shingles. But the adult versions of this occasion, boosted by psychological tendencies preserving ideologies, are not funny and can bring down whole civilizations. The Middle East now presents such a threat. By now, the resources spent by Jews, Arabs, and all others over a small amount of disputed land, if divided arbitrarily among land claimants, would have made everyone better off, even before taking into account any benefit from reduced threat of war, possibly nuclear. Outside domestic relations, it is rare now to try to resolve disputes by techniques including discussion of impacts from psychological tendencies, considering the implications of childishness that would be raised by such inclusion and the defects of psychology as now taught. This result may be sound. But given the nuclear stakes now involved and the many failures in important negotiations lasting decades, I often wonder if someday, in some way, more use of psychological insight will eventually improve outcomes. If so, correct teaching of psychology matters a lot. And if old psychology professors are even less likely than old physics professors to learn new ways, which seems nearly certain, then we may, as Max Planck predicted, need a new generation of psychology professors who have grown up to think in a different way. If only one lesson is to be chosen from a package of lessons involving social proof tendency and used in self-improvement, my favorite would be learn how to ignore the examples from others when they are wrong, because few skills are more worth having. 16. Contrast, misreaction, tendency. Because the nervous system of man does not naturally measure in absolute scientific units, it must instead rely on something simpler. The eyes have a solution that limits their programming needs. The contrast in what is seen is registered. And as in sight, so does it go, largely, in the other senses. Moreover, as perception goes, so goes cognition. The result is man's contrast misreaction tendency. Few psychological tendencies do more damage to correct thinking. Small-scale damages involve instances such as man's buying an overpriced $1,000 leather dashboard merely because the price is so low, compared to his concurrent purchase of a $65,000 car. Large-scale damages often ruin lives, as when a wonderful woman having terrible parents marries a man who would be judged satisfactory only in comparison to her parents. Or as when a man takes wife number 2, who would be appraised as all right only in comparison to wife number 1. A particularly reprehensible form of sales practice occurs in the offices of some real estate brokers. A buyer from out of the city, perhaps needing to shift his family there, visits the office with little time available. The salesman deliberately shows the customer 3 awful houses at ridiculously high prices. Then he shows him a merely bad house at a price only moderately too high, and boom, the broker often makes an easy sale. Contrast misreaction tendency is routinely used to cause disadvantage for customers buying merchandise and services. To make an ordinary price seem low, the vendor will very frequently create a high artificial price that is much higher than the price always sought. Then advertise his standard price as a big reduction from his phony price. Even when people know this sort of customer manipulation is being attempted, it will often work to trigger buying. This phenomenon accounts in part for much advertising in newspapers. It also demonstrates that being aware of psychological ploys is not a perfect defense. When a man's steps are consecutively taken toward disaster, with each step being very small, the brain's contrast misreaction tendency will often let the man go too far toward disaster to be able to avoid it. This happens because each step presents so small a contrast from his present position. A bridge-playing pal of mine once told me that a frog tossed into very hot water would jump out, but that the same frog would end up dying if placed in room temperature water that was later heated at a very slow rate. My few shreds of physiological knowledge make me doubt this account, but no matter how many businesses die in just the manner claimed by my friend for the frog, cognition misled by tiny changes involving low contrast will often miss a trend that is destiny. One of Ben Franklin's best remembered and most useful aphorisms is, "A small leak will sink a great ship." The utility of the aphorism is large precisely because the brain so often misses the functional equivalent of a small leak in a great ship. 17. Stress, influence, tendency. Everyone recognizes that sudden stress, for instance from a threat, will cause a rush of adrenaline in the human body, prompting faster and more extreme reaction. And everyone who has taken Psych 101 knows that stress makes social proof tendency more powerful. In a phenomenon less well recognized but still widely known, light stress can slightly improve performance, say in examinations, whereas heavy stress causes dysfunction. But few people know more about really heavy stress than that it can cause depression. For instance, most people know that an acute stress depression makes thinking dysfunctional because it causes an extreme of pessimism, often extended in length and usually accompanied by activity-stopping fatigue. Fortunately, as most people also know, such a depression is one of mankind's more reversible ailments. Even before modern drugs were available, many people afflicted by depression, such as Winston Churchill and Samuel Johnson, gained great achievement in life. Most people know very little about non-depressive mental breakdowns influenced by heavy stress, but there is at least one exception involving the work of Pavlov. When he was in his 70s and 80s, Pavlov had won a Nobel Prize early in life by using dogs to work out the physiology of digestion. Then he became world famous by working out mere association responses in dogs. Initially salivating dogs, so much so that changes in behavior triggered by mere association, like those caused by much modern advertisement, are today often said to come from Pavlovian conditioning. What happened to cause Pavlov's last work was especially interesting. During the Great Leningrad Flood of the 1920s, Pavlov had many dogs in cages. Their habits had been transformed by a combination of his Pavlovian conditioning plus standard reward responses into distinct and different patterns. As the waters of the flood came up and receded, many dogs reached a point where they had almost no airspace between their noses and the top of their cages. This subjected them to maximum stress. Immediately thereafter, Pavlov noticed that many of the dogs were no longer behaving as they had. The dog that had formerly liked his trainer now disliked him, for example. This result reminds one of modern cognition reversals in which a person's love of his parents suddenly becomes hate, as new love has been shifted suddenly to a cult. The unanticipated extreme changes in Pavlov's dogs would have driven any good experimental scientist into a near frenzy of curiosity. That was indeed Pavlov's reaction, but not many scientists would have done what Pavlov next did, and that was to spend the rest of his life giving stress-induced nervous breakdowns to dogs, after which he would try to reverse the breakdowns, all the while keeping careful experimental records. He found, one, that he could classify dogs so as to predict how easily a particular dog would break down. 2, that the dogs hardest to break down were also the hardest to return to their pre-breakdown state. 3, that any dog could be broken down. And 4, that he couldn't reverse a breakdown except by reimposing stress. Now, practically everyone is revolted by such experimental treatment of man's friend, the dog. Moreover, Pavlov was Russian and did his work under the communists, and maybe those facts account for the present extreme, widespread ignorance of Pavlov's last work. The two Freudian psychiatrists with whom I tried many years ago to discuss this work had never heard of it, and the dean of a major medical school actually asked me several years ago if any of Pavlov's experiments were repeatable in experiments of other researchers. Obviously, Pavlov is now a sort of forgotten hero in medical science. I first found a description of Pavlov's last work in a popular paperback, written by some Rockefeller finance psychiatrist, when I was trying to figure out, 1, how cults worked their horrible mischief, and 2, what should the law say about what parents could do to deprogram children who had become brainwashed zombies. Naturally, mainstream law objected to the zombies being physically captured by their parents, and next subjected to stress that would help to deprogram the effects of the stress they had endured in cult conversions. I never wanted to get into legal controversy that existed about this subject, but I did conclude that the controversy couldn't be handled with maximized rationality without considering whether, as Pavlov's last work suggests, the heavy-handed imposition of stress might be the only reversal method that would work to remedy one of the worst evils imaginable, a stolen mind. I have included this discussion of Pavlov 1, partly out of general antagonism toward taboos, 2, partly to make my talk reasonably complete as it considers stress, and 3, partly because I hope some listener may continue my inquiry with more success. 18. Availability misweighing tendency. This mental tendency echoes the words of the song, "When I'm not near the girl I love the girl I'm near." Man's imperfect, limited capacity brain easily drafts into working with what's easily available to it, and the brain can't use what it can't remember, or what is blocked from recognizing because it is heavily influenced by one or more psychological tendencies bearing strongly on it, as the fellow is influenced by the nearby girl in the song. And so, the mind overweighs what is easily available and thus displays availability, misweighing, tendency. This main antidote to miscues from availability, misweighing tendency often involve procedures, including use of checklists, which are almost always helpful. Another antidote is to behave somewhat like Darwin did when he emphasized disconfirming evidence. What should be done is to especially emphasize factors that don't produce reams of easily available numbers, instead of drifting mostly or entirely into considering factors that do produce such numbers. Still, another antidote is to find and hire some skeptical, articulate people with far-reaching minds to act as advocates for notions that are opposite to the incumbent notions. One consequence of this tendency is that extra vivid evidence, being so memorable and thus more available in cognition, should often consciously be underweighed, while less vivid evidence should be overweighed. Still, the special strength of extra vivid images in influencing the mind can be constructively used, 1, in persuading someone else to reach a correct conclusion, or 2, as a device for improving one's own memory by attaching vivid images, one after the other, to many items one doesn't want to forget. Indeed, such use of vivid images as memory boosters is what enabled the great orators of classical Greece and Rome to give such long, organized speeches without using notes. The great algorithm to remember in dealing with this tendency is simple. An idea or a fact is not worth more merely because it is easily available to you. 19. Use it or lose it tendency. All skills attenuate with disuse. I was a whiz at calculus until age 20, after which the skill was soon obliterated by total non-use. The right antidote to such a loss is to make use of the functional equivalent of the aircraft simulator employed in pilot training. This allows a pilot to continuously practice all of the rarely used skills that he can't afford to lose. Throughout his life, a wise man engages in practice of all his useful, rarely used skills, many of them outside his discipline, as a sort of duty to his better self. If he reduces the number of skills he practices, and therefore the number of skills he retains, he will naturally drift into error from man with a hammer tendency. His learning capacity will also shrink, as he creates gaps in the latticework of theory he needs as a framework for understanding new experience. It is also essential for a thinking man to assemble his skills into a checklist that he routinely uses. Any other mode of operation will cause him to miss much that is important. Skills of a very high order can be maintained only with daily practice. The pianist Paderewski once said that if he failed to practice for a single day, he could notice his performance deterioration, and that after a week's gap in practice, the audience could notice it as well. The hard rule of use it or lose it tendency tempers its harshness for the diligent. If a skill is raised to fluency, instead of merely being crammed in briefly to enable one to pass some test, then the skill 1 will be lost more slowly and 2 will come back faster when refreshed with new learning. These are not minor advantages, and a wise man engaged in learning some important skill will not stop until he is really fluent in it. 20. Drug misinfluence tendency. This tendency's destructive power is so widely known to be intense, with frequent tragic consequences for cognition and the outcome of life, that it needs no discussion here to supplement that previously given under simple pain-avoiding psychological denial. 21. Senescence misinfluence tendency. With advanced age, there comes a natural cognitive decay, differing among individuals in the earliness of its arrival and the speed of its progression. Practically no one is good at learning complex new skills when very old, but some people remain pretty good in maintaining intensely practiced old skills until late in life, as one can notice in many a bridge tournament. Old people like me get pretty skilled without working at it, at disguising age-related deterioration, because social convention, like clothing, hides much decline. Continuous thinking and learning done with joy can somewhat help delay what is inevitable. 22. Authority misinfluence tendency. Living in dominance hierarchies as he does, like all his ancestors before him, man was born mostly to follow leaders, with only a few people doing the leading, and so human society is formally organized into dominance hierarchies, with their culture augmenting the natural follow-the-leader tendency of man. But automatic as most human reactions are, with the tendency to follow leaders being no exception, man is often destined to suffer greatly when the leader is wrong, or when his leader's ideas don't get through properly in the bustle of life and are misunderstood. And so we find much miscognition from man's authority misinfluence tendency. Some of the misinfluences are amusing, as in a case described by Cialdini. A physician left a written order for a nurse treating an earache as follows: 2 drops twice a day, ear. The nurse then directed the patient to turn over and put the eardrops in his anus. Other versions of confused instructions from authority figures are tragic. In World War II, a new pilot for a general who sat beside him in the co-pilot seat was so anxious to please his boss that he misinterpreted some minor shift in the general's position as the direction to do some foolish thing. The pilot crashed the plane and became a paraplegic. Well, naturally, cases like this one get the attention of careful thinkers like Boss Buffett, who always acts like an overquiet mouse around his pilots. Such cases are also given attention in the simulator training of co-pilots, who have to learn to ignore certain really foolish orders from boss pilots, because boss pilots will sometimes err disastrously. Even after going through such a training regime, however, co-pilots and simulator exercises will too often allow the simulated plane to crash because of some extreme and perfectly obvious simulated error of the chief pilot. After Corporal Hitler had risen to dominate Germany, leading a bunch of believing Lutherans and Catholics into orgies of genocide and other mass destruction, one clever psychology professor, Stanley Milgram, decided to do an experiment to determine exactly how far authority figures could lead ordinary people into gross misbehavior. In this experiment, a man posing as an authority figure, namely a professor governing a respectable experiment, was able to trick a great many ordinary people into giving what they had every reason to believe were massive electric shocks that inflicted heavy torture on innocent fellow citizens. This experiment did demonstrate a terrible result, contributed to by authority misinfluence tendency, but it also demonstrated extreme ignorance in the psychology professorate right after World War II. Almost any intelligent person with my checklist of psychological tendencies in his hand, by simply going down the checklist, have seen that Milgram's experiment involved about 6 powerful psychological tendencies acting in confluence to bring about his extreme experimental result. For instance, the person pushing Milgram's shock lever was given much social proof from presence of inactive bystanders, whose silence communicated that his behavior was okay. Yet it took over 1,000 psychological papers published before I got to Milgram for the professorate to get his experiment only about 90% as well understood as it would have been immediately by any intelligent person who used any sensible organization of psychology along the lines of this talk, plus 2, a checklist procedure. This outcome displaying the dysfunctional thinking of long-dead professors deserves a better explanation. I will later deal with the subject in a very hesitant fashion. We can be pleased that the psychology professorate of a former era wasn't quite as dysfunctional as the angler in my next to last illustration of authority misinfluence tendency. When I once fished in the Rio Colorado in Costa Rica, my guide, in a state of shock, told me about an angler who'd earlier come to the river without ever having fished for a tarpon. A fishing guide like the one I had runs the boat and gives fishing advice, establishing himself in this context as the ultimate authority figure. In the case of this guide, his native language was Spanish, while the angler's native language was English. The angler got a big tarpon on and began submitting to many directions from the authority figure, called a guide. Tip up, tip down, reel in, etc. Finally, when it was necessary to put more pressure on the fish by causing more bending of the angler's rod, the guide said in English, "Give him the rod, give him the rod." Well, the angler threw his expensive rod at the fish, and when last seen, it was going down the Rio Colorado toward the ocean. This example shows how powerful is the tendency to go along with an authority figure and how it can turn one's brain into mush. My final example comes from business. A psychology PhD once became a CEO of a major company and went wild, creating an expensive new headquarters with a great wine cellar at an isolated site. At some point, his underlings remonstrated that money was running short. "Take the money out of the depreciation reserves," said the CEO. Not too easy, because a depreciation reserve is a liability account. So strong is undue respect for authority that this CEO, and many even worse examples, have actually been allowed to remain in control of important business institutions for long periods after it was clear they should have been removed. The business implication: be careful whom you appoint to power, because a dominant authority figure will often be hard to remove. aided as he will be by authority misinfluence tendency. 23. Twaddle tendency. Man as a social animal who has the gift of language is born to prattle and to pour out twaddle that does much damage when serious work is being attempted. Some people produce copious amounts of twaddle, and others very little. A trouble from the honeybee version of twaddle was once demonstrated in an interesting experiment. A honeybee normally goes out and finds nectar, and then comes back and does a dance that communicates to the other bees where the nectar is. The other bees then go out and get it. Well, some scientists, clever like B.F. Skinner, decided to see how well a honeybee would do with a handicap. He put the nectar straight up, way up, well in a natural setting. There is no nectar a long way straight up, and the poor honeybee doesn't have a genetic program that is adequate to handle what she now has to communicate. You might guess that this honeybee would come back to the hive and slink into a corner, but she doesn't. She comes into the hive and does an incoherent dance. Well, all my life I've been dealing with the human equivalent of that honeybee, and it's very important for wise administration to keep prattling people pouring out twaddle far away from the serious work. A rightly famous Caltech engineering professor, exhibiting more insight than tact, once expressed his version of this idea as follows: the principal job of an academic administration is to keep the people who don't matter from interfering with the work of the people that do. I include this quotation partly because I long suffered from backlash caused by my version of this professor's conversational manner. After much effort, I was able to improve only slightly, so one of my reasons for supplying the quotation is my hope that, at least in comparison, I will appear tactful. 24. Reason-respecting tendency. There is in man, particularly one in an advanced culture, a natural love of accurate cognition and a joy in its exercise. This accounts for the widespread popularity of crossword puzzles, other puzzles, and bridge and chess columns, as well as all games requiring mental skill. This tendency has an obvious implication. It makes man especially prone to learn well when a would-be teacher gives correct reasons for what is taught, instead of simply laying out the desired belief ex cathedra with no reasons given. Few practices, therefore, are wiser than not only thinking through reasons before giving orders, but also communicating these reasons to the recipient of the order. No one knew this better than Karl Braun, who designed oil refineries with spectacular skill and integrity. He had a very simple rule, one of many in his large Teutonic company. You had to tell who was to do what, where, when, and why. If you wrote a communication leaving out your explanation of why the addressee was to do what was ordered, Braun was likely to fire you because Braun well knew that ideas got through best when reasons for the ideas were meticulously laid out. In general, learning is most easily assimilated and used when lifelong people consistently hang their experience, actual and vicarious, on a latticework of theory, answering the question why. Indeed, the question why is a sort of Rosetta Stone opening up the major potentiality of mental life. Unfortunately, reason-respecting tendency is so strong that even a person's giving of meaningless or incorrect reasons will increase compliance with his orders and requests. This has been demonstrated in psychology experiments wherein compliance practitioners successfully jump to the head of the lines in front of copying machines by explaining their reason. I have to make some copies. This sort of unfortunate byproduct of reasoning-respecting tendency is a conditioned reflex based on a widespread appreciation of the importance of reasons. And naturally, the practice of laying out various claptrap reasons is much used by commercial and cult compliance practitioners to help them get what they don't deserve. 25. Lollapalooza tendency. The tendency to get extreme consequences from confluences of psychological tendencies acting in favor of a particular outcome. This tendency was not in any of the psychology texts I once examined, at least in any coherent fashion. Yet, it dominates life. It accounts for the extreme result in the Milgram experiment and the extreme success of some cults that have stumbled through practice evolution into bringing pressure from many psychological tendencies to bear at the same time on conversion targets. The targets vary in susceptibility, like the dogs Pavlov worked with in his old age. But some of the minds that are targeted simply snap into zombiedom under cult pressure. Indeed, that is one cult's name for the conversion phenomenon: snapping. What are we to make of the extreme ignorance of the psychology textbook writers of yesteryear? How could anyone who had taken a freshman course in physics or chemistry not be driven to consider, above all, how psychological tendencies combine and with what effects? Why would anyone think his study of psychology was adequate without his having endured the complexity involved in dealing with intertwined psychological tendencies? What could be more ironic than professors using oversimplified notions while studying bad cognitive effects grounded in the mind's tendency to use oversimplified algorithms? I will make a few tentative suggestions. Maybe many of the long-dead professors wanted to create a whole science from one narrow type of repeatable psychology experiment that was conductible in a university setting and that aimed at one psychological tendency at a time. If so, these early psychology professors made a massive error in so restricting their approach to their subject. It would be like physics ignoring astrophysics because it couldn't happen in a physics lab, plus all compound effects. What psychological tendencies could account for early psychology professors adopting an over-restrictive approach to their own subject matter? One candidate would be availability misweighing tendency grounded in a preference for easy-to-control data. And then the restrictions would eventually create an extreme case of a man with a hammer tendency. Another candidate might be envy-jealousy tendency, through which early psychology professors displayed some weird form of envy of a physics that was misunderstood. And this possibility tends to demonstrate that leaving envy-jealousy out of academic psychology was never a good idea. I now quit claim all these historical mysteries to my betters. Well, that ends my brief description of psychological tendencies. Questions and answers. Now, as I promised, I will ask and answer a few general questions. My first is a compound question. Isn't this list of psychological tendencies tautological to some extent compared to the system of Euclid? That is, aren't there overlaps in the tendencies? And couldn't the system be laid out just as plausibly in a somewhat different way? The answers are yes, yes, and yes, but this matters only moderately. Further refinement of these tendencies, while desirable, has a limited practical potential because a significant amount of messiness is unfixable in a soft science like psychology. My second question is, can you supply a real-world model instead of a Milgram-type controlled psychology experiment that uses your system to illustrate multiple psychological tendencies interacting in a plausibly diagnosable way? The answer is yes. One of my favorite cases involves the McDonnell Douglas airliner evacuation test. Before a new airliner can be sold, the government requires that it pass an evacuation test, during which a full load of passengers must get out in some short period of time. The government directs that the test be realistic, so you can't pass by evacuating only 20-year-old athletes. So, McDonnell Douglas scheduled such a test in a darkened hangar, using a lot of old people as evacuees. The passenger cabin was, say, 20 feet above the concrete floor of the hangar, and was to be evacuated through moderately flimsy rubber chutes. The first test was made in the morning. There were about 20 very serious injuries, and the evacuation took so long it flunked the time test. So, what did McDonnell Douglas do next? It repeated the test in the afternoon, and this time there was another failure, with about 20 more serious injuries, including one case of permanent paralysis. What psychological tendencies contributed to this terrible result? Well, using my tendency list as a checklist, I come up with the following explanation. Reward super response tendency drove McDonnell Douglas to act fast. It couldn't sell its airliner until it passed the test. Also pushing the company was doubt avoidance tendency, with its natural drive to arrive at a decision and run with it. Then, the government's direction that the test be realistic drove authority misinfluence tendency into the mischief of causing McDonnell Douglas to overreact by using what was obviously too dangerous a test method. By now, the course of action had been decided, so inconsistency avoidance tendency helped preserve the near idiotic plan. When all the old people got to the dark hangar with its high airline cabin and concrete floor, the situation must have made McDonnell Douglas employees very queasy, but they saw other employees and supervisors not objecting. Social proof tendency therefore swamped the queasiness, and this allowed continued action as planned, a continuation that was aided by more authority misinfluence tendency. Then came the disaster of the morning test with its failure, plus serious injuries. McDonnell Douglas ignored the strong disconfirming evidence from the failure of the first test because confirmation bias added by the triggering of strong deprival superreaction tendency favored maintaining the original plan. McDonnell Douglas's deprival superreaction tendency was now like that which causes a gambler bent on getting even after a huge loss to make his final big bet. After all, McDonnell Douglas was going to lose a lot if it didn't pass the test as scheduled. More psychology-based explanation can probably be made, but the foregoing discussion is complete enough to demonstrate the utility of my system when used in a checklist mode. My third question is also compound. In the practical world, what good is the thought system laid out in this list of tendencies? Isn't practical benefit prevented because these psychological tendencies are so thoroughly programmed into the human mind by broad evolution, the combination of genetic and cultural evolution, that we can't get rid of them? Well, the answer is that the tendencies are probably much more good than bad. Otherwise, they wouldn't be there, working pretty well for man, given his condition and his limited brain capacity. So the tendencies can't be simply washed out automatically and shouldn't be. Nevertheless, the psychological thought system described, when properly understood and used, enables the spread of wisdom and good conduct and facilitates the avoidance of disaster. Tendency is not always destiny, and knowing the tendencies and their antidotes can often help prevent trouble that would otherwise occur. Here's a short list of examples reminding us of the great utility of elementary psychological knowledge. 1. Carl Braun's communication practices. 2. The use of simulators in pilot training. 3. The system of Alcoholics Anonymous. 4. Clinical training methods in medical schools. 5. The rules of the U.S. Constitutional Convention. Totally secret meetings. No recorded vote by name until the final vote. Votes reversible at any time before the end of the convention. Then just one vote on the whole Constitution. These are very clever psychology-respecting rules. If the founders had used a different procedure, many people would have been pushed by various psychological tendencies into inconsistent, hardened positions. The elite founders got our Constitution through by a whisker, only because they were psychologically acute. 6. The use of Granny's incentive-driven rule to manipulate oneself toward better performance of one's duties. 7. The Harvard Business School's emphasis on decision trees. When I was young and foolish, I used to laugh at the Harvard Business School. I said, they're teaching 28-year-old people that high school algebra works in real life. But later, I wised up and realized that it was very important that they do that to counter some bad effects from psychological tendencies. Better late than never. 8. The use of autopsy equivalents at Johnson & Johnson. At most corporations, if you make an acquisition and it turns out to be a disaster, all the people, paperwork, and presentations that caused the foolish acquisition are quickly forgotten. Nobody wants to be associated with the poor outcome by mentioning it. But at Johnson & Johnson's, the rules make everybody revisit old acquisitions, comparing predictions with outcomes. That is a very smart thing to do. 9. The great example of Charles Darwin as he avoided confirmation bias, which has morphed into the extreme anti-confirmation bias method of the double-blind studies wisely required in drug research by the FDA. 10. The Warren Buffett rule for open outcry auctions. Don't go. My fourth question is, what special knowledge problems lie buried in the thought system demonstrated by your list? Well, one answer is paradox. In social psychology, the more people learn about the system, the less it is true. And this is what gives the system its great value, as a preventer of bad outcomes and a driver of good outcomes. This result is paradoxical and doesn't remind one of elementary physics, but so what? One can't get all the paradox out of pure math, so why should psychology be shocked by some paradox? There is also some paradox in cognition change that works even when the manipulated person knows he is being manipulated. This creates a sort of paradox in a paradox, but again, so what? I once much enjoyed an occasion of this sort. I drew this beautiful woman as my dinner partner many years ago. I'd never seen her before. She was married to a prominent Los Angeles man. She sat down next to me, turned her beautiful face up, and said, "Charlie, what one word accounts for your remarkable success in life?" I knew I was being manipulated by a practiced routine, and I just loved it. I never see this woman without a little lift in my spirits. And by the way, I told her I was rational. You'll have to judge yourself whether that's true. I may be demonstrating some psychological tendency I hadn't planned on demonstrating. My fifth question: don't we need more reconciliation of psychology and economics? The answer is yes, and I suspect that some slight progress is being made. I have heard of one such example. Colin Cameron of Caltech, who works in experimental economics, devised an interesting experiment in which he caused high IQ students playing for real money to pay price A plus B for security they knew would turn into A dollars at the end of the day. This foolish action occurred because the students were allowed to trade with each other in a liquid market for the security. And some students then paid price A plus B because they hoped to unload on other students at a higher price before the day was over. What I will now confidently predict is that despite Cameron's experimental outcome, most economic and corporate finance professors who still believe in the hard-form efficient market hypothesis will retain their original belief. If so, this will be one more indication of how irrational smart people can be when influenced by psychological tendencies. My sixth question is, don't moral and prudential problems come with knowledge of these psychological tendencies? The answer is yes. For instance, psychological knowledge improves persuasive power, and like other power, it can be used for good or ill. Captain Cook once played a psychology-based trick on his seamen to cause them to eat sauerkraut and avoid scurvy. In my opinion, this action was both ethical and wise under the circumstances, despite the deliberate manipulation involved. But ordinarily, when you try to use your knowledge of psychological tendencies in the artful manipulation of someone whose trust you need, you will be making both a moral and prudential error. The moral error is obvious. The prudential error comes because many intelligent people targeted for conscious manipulation are likely to figure out what you're trying to do and resent your action. My final question: aren't there factual and reasoning errors in this talk? The answer is yes, almost surely yes. The final revision was made from memory over 50 hours by a man 81 years old who never took a course in psychology and has read none of it except one book on developmental psychology for nearly 15 years. Even so, I think the totality of my talk will stand up very well, and I hope all my descendants and friends will carefully consider what I have said. I even hope that more psychology professors will join me in making heavy use of inversion and driving for a complete description of the psychological system so that it works better as a checklist, and especially emphasizing effects from combinations of psychological tendencies. Well, that ends my talk. If in considering what I have said, you had 10% the fun I had saying it, you were lucky recipients.